Hello, and welcome to the Guilbault Girls Show, where you will have the opportunity to hear from mothers, fathers, siblings, and individuals themselves about their journey of living with a disability. I know, it's called Guilbault Girls, but we have a bonus for you as we get the Guilbault boys to interview some of the dads and siblings and get their perspectives too. We'll also have special guests from time to time to share the many resources that are available to those living with a disability and their families. So get ready to laugh, smile, cry, maybe even get a little angry when you hear some of these stories of their day-to-day struggles. But let's not forget their many triumphs. As they say, it takes a village. And if it weren't for our village, we wouldn't be where we are today. So join us. Hello, and welcome back to another episode of the Guilbault Girls. I'm your host, Karen, and today's guest is Meg Zucker. Meg is a graduate of the University of Wisconsin-Madison and NYU School of Law and is an attorney and leader in anti-money laundering and financial crimes on Wall Street. She's also the founder and president of Don't Hide It, Flaunt It, which is a nonprofit whose mission is to advance understanding, tolerance, and mutual respect for people's differences. It provides Flaunt It social emotional learning and anti-bullying programming to public and private schools, universities, community service organizations, and diversity, equity, and inclusion programs at Fortune 500 companies. Meg is a high-demand speaker and activist. She has been featured on the Today Show and was a keynote speaker in the Distinguished American Speakers Series in Tel Aviv, hosted by the U.S. Ambassador to Israel. Meg's writings have appeared in Parents Magazine, USA Today, Scholastic Storyworks, The Jewish Forward, The Mighty, Motherwell, and Scary Mommy. The Zucker family was also the subject of a TLC special, which was called My Extraordinary Family. I had the pleasure of meeting Meg back in 2016. She also published a Flaunt It for Faith. And then we've just kept in touch on and off since. And then in 2020, she reached out and she had asked if I would be willing to write a piece to be in her upcoming book called Born Extraordinary on empowering children with differences and disabilities, which is what we're going to dive into today. So welcome, Meg. I'm so excited to have you on the show. And I'm even more excited for your book to launch on March 7th. So welcome.
Thank you. It's so wonderful to be here. I appreciate it.
You're welcome. So before we dive into the book, let's start with your journey. Can you tell the folks a little bit more about the genetic condition that you were born with, how it affected you, and what it was like growing up?
So I was born with a genetic condition, as you mentioned, called ectrodactyly. I always joke, even in the book, that it sounds like a dinosaur type, but I'm not a dinosaur type, that is. I was born with, and it's so hard to do these sort of, not in person, but one finger on each hand, shortened forearms, and one toe on each foot. And when I say one toe on each foot, it's not like a foot that looks like anybody else's foot. It really is just sort of this round, almost stump of a foot with a toe on it. So, my feet are very small. And so when you said what it's like, it's interesting. I mean, and we can get into this at any level you want, but yeah. I was born in the United States, but then my parents, when I was 1, we moved abroad to countries in the Middle East and South Asia and back and forth to the US. Eventually, I came back to the US for high school. But I say that because my experience and what it was like was very different depending on where I lived. I mean, in the United States, certainly it was a different type of experience. I would say that my feelings of embarrassment about, and that's the best way I can describe it, embarrassment were really more coming from myself. And in other words, I don't think the world around me was doing things overtly to make me feel embarrassed.
Right.
But, and I certainly had a supportive family. And we can talk about that as we talk further about the book. But I did hide my hands. I mean, I really did. I didn't want people to stare. I was very frustrated by it. I'm super social. So to me, that's the last thing we should be talking about. I'd rather be talking about, something more fun or interesting. And so I was really focused on not defining my life about my physical difference. But living abroad was different. In the countries that I lived, people that were physically different or disabled were truly, I mean, if you think about rungs of society, if the homeless is in one layer, we're below. And,
Mhm.
There really was, I'll never forget just walking the streets of Cairo or, in Pakistan, and, all I would hear is, and I guess the best way I could put it is, people take one glance and look at you when you're different, especially physically different,
Mhm.
and they might think pity.
Right.
But when I was living in different countries out there, I think it was a much more verbal expression and reaction. So now
Mhm.
I've spoken a lot, so I'll just
Oh
pause.
my gosh, no, this is what it's all about. We just talk and go with the flow. And it's I had interviewed Alex Barone, who's an actor and mentor, and he has 2 or 3 fingers now, I can't remember, on each hand. And he said growing up that his mother actually sewed his pockets because he would always put his hands and hide his hands in his pocket. So she sewed
Wow.
his pockets up so he couldn't, to kind of get him over that, feeling.
Man, I wish I knew about that mom. She should have been a contributor to my book. That's
Yes,
awesome.
right. I'm going to be interviewing her too.
Awesome.
Uh-huh. Yeah.
Yeah, no, pockets were my savior when I was a kid. And, look, I think people have different types of, levels of maturity and growth that they have to experience.
Mhm.
And so for me, that was definitely what I was a hider. As we talk through, different areas of the book that I cover, certainly I didn't back then, and now I am going to make myself sound like a dinosaur, but pre-internet, I didn't have the same type of communities or community that I think is available
Yeah.
to, when you have a child or you are a person that is physically different in particular or otherwise.
Yeah. And I think too, since you moved around a lot, it's not like you were okay at one school and everybody knew you and got used to you. And it was just like, for moving around, it's like you have to live that whole feeling over again of something new and a new place and all of that. So I couldn't, yeah, that would be very, very hard.
You're right.
What,
It was forced socialization over and over and over again, for
yeah,
sure.
yeah, absolutely. I know that you passed your genetic condition on to both of your sons. So can you share some of their experiences growing up, which ultimately led you to start Don't Hide It, Flaunt It?
Yeah, for sure. And definitely stories about them, as you were referencing, are in the book, as well as, thankfully, just a multitude of families that are parenting kids with differences or disabilities have contributed. So happy to talk about mine, but I love hearing about the stories of others as well. In terms of what prompted me to start Don't Hide It, Flaunt It. So yes, I did pass along my genetic condition. And it was my biggest fear. I just want to be super transparent about that. Most people that have concerns that, potentially something might go wrong, or however you want to, phrase that in the term of fear. I was very afraid of it. And so when it finally happened, and I think we'll talk about this later, it was a real reckoning for me. But I really, once we had Ethan, who has one finger on each hand, 2 toes on each foot, extradactyly doesn't mean everyone has to have one finger. It means
Right.
missing digits, and
Right.
so it just means some kind of version of it. And so then Charlie has 2 fingers on each hand. That's our second son. Our daughter Savannah is not born with extradactyly, but between the 3 of us, we have 18 hands and fingers, or hands and fingers and toes, excuse me. Just to put that into perspective. So what prompted me to start it was really not immediately. It wasn't like, oh my gosh, I have a child who has my genetic condition and now I need to start an organization. It wasn't like that at all. In fact, I have a day job. I'm an attorney. I try to put people in
Yeah. I
jail.
don't know how you do it all, but go ahead.
That's a whole different discussion, but I really was, the right word, Karen, is assimilation. Like I was going to raise them like my parents, empowered me, but also I was just like, okay, this is what I am, but it doesn't define me. It doesn't have to be who I am in terms of my life road. And so I was very happy not focusing on it and continuing down my legal path. And so it wasn't until Ethan, our oldest, was, and this is a long time ago, he's a junior in college now. So, but crazy. But I got a call on 9/11, not that 9/11, but I will tell you it was 5 years later. So it was, it was a time, so it was 2007 or so. And the principal called me and said, listen, you need to come in. There's been a bullying incident at school. And I, went there and I heard about Ethan and the experience, which is, of course, for any parent, traumatic. For me, I felt just sort of old pangs of guilt, like, oh my gosh, this is
because you've kind of lived it.
I blame myself. I also blame myself. I knew what it feels like. And now my kids are like that. And it was really hard. I was not bullied, though, I have to say. And it's something that, we'll talk a little bit about during the book, because there's an entire chapter on that subject. But when Ethan was bullied, the principal said, come and speak to my faculty, give him some guidance. How do they empower a kid like yours who's different? And that was really interesting to me because I had never had that platform. And so I'm like, well, let me talk about it, just treat him like everybody else. That's, how he wants to be treated. But then I kept thinking about the kids that were willing to be mean to him and felt like, well, wait a minute, what about them? And so that's when I walked away, and the idea of, something called Kids Flaunt, which was a social emotional learning program that I began to pilot, where I came up with the theme, the things that make me different, make me me. And kids would, write an essay or create some art with that theme in mind. The whole goal was to empower kids that looked or felt different and help them transform themselves from and I always say this, from a something to a someone to the other students. And then for all these other kids, it's like, they would run up to me when I was piloting this program in schools, and they're like, Mrs. Zucker, I'm not different. There's nothing different about me. I'm like, well, we're not all robots. And isn't there something about you or your family, maybe it's visible, maybe it's invisible, that you wouldn't want someone to make fun of or judge? Could be anything. Could be that you're small. Could be that, you wear glasses. Could be that you have braces. Could be you have two moms, like whatever the case may be. What is it that you feel a little bit more vulnerable? And that was the sort of sweet spot of teaching empathy. And that was just an incredible opportunity. So that's when I began Don't Hide It, Flaunt It, because I realized that, and this was so many years ago, right? That there's so much more curriculum now in terms of inclusion and belonging, and in a great way. There's a lot of space for it. So, but I felt like a pioneer back then in this topic, and we, launched this, program, and as you mentioned, it expanded, and it was one of the best things about it was it felt, I cried when the kids submitted their first essays in art, bawled.
Yeah, I could imagine.
I just, even this week, I ran into somebody, and she said, Meg, my son participated in that, and he wrote about being the child of a divorce, and he felt really vulnerable and different and ashamed and all this kind of stuff. And I started realizing, Karen, I'm like, oh my gosh, this gave me, and that's just one example, but so really the differences varied, but that's okay. But what I loved and the most was when I'd hear from parents, and I'm like, wow, these kids are sharing things they're not even telling their parents about.
Yeah.
So at that really, really motivated me to continue on, to have Don't Hide It, Flaunt It, not only create this programming, but become a 501c3 nonprofit. So I'll pause again.
Okay, well, let's talk about the upcoming book that's launching, which is on March 7th, correct?
Yes, March
All
7th.
right. Called
2020.
Born Extraordinary. Am I saying that right?
Born
Extraordinary,
extraordinary.
extraordinary, extraordinary. I'm like, do you see
Born
it? Like,
extraordinary. Yes.
so what inspired you to write this book? And then we can kind of like have you walk us through each chapter, really.
So that's the funny thing about this. Like, I always wanted to, be a writer. And in fact, before Don't Had It Flaunt It, before everything, as I did mention, I have a legal background, but in my head, I wanted to write a memoir. I thought, well, and here's what happened. I was going to a high school reunion and I asked, oh, is so and so going? And they're like, no, she's gained some weight, so she doesn't want to go. I'm like, what? I walk this earth with one finger on each hand and I'm going, what? But that's unfair for me to judge, right? And so, like, for me, I originally I signed with my literary agent, and who took a huge leap of faith with me, because I'd mainly done legal writing and started to write some articles in magazines and things like that. And
I
just
don't mean to laugh. I see the cat up behind
my
you.
cat, like, oh my
I'm like,
God.
wait, what is that behind her head?
He's a Siberian, and there's two of them. So that's
I love it.
that's the little brother. Can you believe it? I know. That's Jetty.
Oh, all right. So sorry. I didn't mean to interrupt you. So go ahead.
Sorry about that.
No, you're fine. I love it.
Yeah. So the whole thing before Don't Hide It, Flaunt It, and before the bullying incident, I actually really wanted to write a memoir. And I did start to write one. And quite frankly, it wasn't connecting. In other words, it wasn't something where I think memoirs, especially, they're either obviously written by celebrities or they're written by people that have had the most excruciating life, gotten through it, and they're speaking their truth. And I applaud anyone under that living through that. But my life wasn't excruciatingly hard. There are elements for sure, but the memoirs piece of it and angle sort of failed. And actually my agent said, Meg, you really are just a one-fingered person that's a lawyer. So if you really want to write, I think you need a platform. And so that's when, after the bullying incident, I'm like, I think I'm going to pause on the book and I'm going to just build, and not because I need a platform, but more like, oh, maybe this is what I'm meant to do. Maybe I'm not really meant to write a book. I am meant to create this organization so I can help empower kids. And so, and quite frankly, people of all ages, because our program, oh my gosh, I just saw your dog.
Yes.
So animals have joined.
That's awesome. They have joined us.
Love. So what a beauty. So, so these years along the way, I continued to write in magazines, and yes, we did the TLC thing. And actually, the Today Show picked up something from one of my parents' articles. And so that's why I did TV. But in general, I really was focused on my nonprofit, but something happened along the way. And you mentioned it yourself. I kept meeting incredible parents. It was like parents that, to me, I mean, even just the mom that you just described, like I came to realize that my story is not enough, because what people deserve is to hear, nuggets of wisdom and, almost like 360-degree angle of a lot of different, and I'm not talking limb difference. I'm talking about everybody who's parenting a child with their own version of normal. As I say, these kids are just capable of living within their means. No, when we're at home, that's our safe space, but we're not thinking of it as a safe space. We just think of it as our space, where we feel comfortable, and we step outside. And I started realizing that there were so many incredible, and no wonder I originally wanted to be a journalist. I always want people's stories. So I'm like, oh my gosh, there's so many important things that people have to say that I wouldn't have even thought of or did or whatever. And so they deserve their own voice and their own platform. Just like, as you said, you contributed to the book, and that was necessary. What you described was actually really important in the book, because it was a different vantage that I wouldn't have thought about parenting my own child or
Yeah.
children. So
And that's another reason too why I started the podcast and the YouTube show, is to have, the parents and the siblings and the individuals, and to share their journeys, because everybody goes through, there's so much that we go through in life, but we handle it in different ways where you wouldn't even know, you know what I mean? And just giving that advice and letting people know that they're not alone. There's other people out there that, that have kind of walked some of this walk, and
yes,
just connecting and networking.
totally,
So
totally agree.
So let's start with, all right, so you have the first chapter, why different? So if you can just kind of tell us a little bit about each chapter, we'll go through, and I can't wait.
Yeah. And that's not even a chapter. That's it. So
Okay.
there's an introduction, and then why difference is a section, because, mainly in this, in fact, I'll tell you something that I haven't said yet. This was originally going to be called Born Different. And then we switched. I think you even know that. And then we started realizing, like, well, and if anything, not everybody that has some kind of visible or even invisible difference necessarily labels themselves as different, as disabled, all this kind of stuff.
Mhm.
I happen to use the label difference. And so I felt like I needed to address it, why, but also make certain people felt comfortable that, whatever you apply to your, yourself or your child, or children, this book is not here to try and force you to come to the, hey, do what I do. It's not that.
Right.
It's just recognizing it. In the book, I explain why I choose this, but then also saying, obviously there's a lot of incredible people that, literally fly the pride of, using disability and embrace it, and good for them. And it was a journey, quite frankly, for me to get there. And now I get it all. It's almost like I get it all, and it doesn't matter, and as I say this in the book, this is really for anyone who feels like they're viewed as atypical, outside the norm. And that's all it is. So label schmabel.
Right.
It doesn't really matter.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay. Embracing the new normal.
Yeah. Okay. So I would tell you, this is probably my favorite chapter. And one of the things about the title, when it says Born Extraordinary, it's not just born. Like, there's a lot of stories of different parents, obviously, in the book too, but sometimes things happen along the way. There's a little girl named Chloe who has a twin that her mom is a contributor, for example, and she ended up getting a virus when she was 5, and became, has a disability now. And so I think it's something to say right away that embracing the new normal doesn't have to be that you're sitting there in the hospital or lying there in the hospital and now this is happening. I want to be clear. It's really more about not the situation and the timing, but the mindset. Because whether it happens then or it happens along the way, this is your new normal as a parent. And it can absolutely be crushing. Maybe this was my biggest fear because it was more than speculation for me, but it can be absolutely the most crushing experience. And what I work through in this chapter is, and I hate to say this is my favorite chapter, but when I've read it, I'm like, oh, I think this still is my favorite. And it's my favorite because I think it's super raw. I think I talk through, sort of, okay, here's how low I sunk. I sunk really low. And here's how I transcended from that to view being the parent of my children as a total gift. And but you just can't get there. There has to be sort of a road towards that. And also being really honest with yourself. Are you the kind of person that I was, that, I was more consumed with, I was hiding my hands and so forth. Are you like someone like my husband who was like, here's Ethan, everybody, so, embracing the new normal is really, really important, because how can we possibly, expect unconditional acceptance and strength from our kids if we haven't arrived that for ourselves yet?
Yep. And I remember you saying that, when you were working on some parts of the book, but I remember you saying that's going to be the hardest because you have to be really vulnerable, when you were writing it.
Yeah.
Okay, so helping them find their dignity. How about that one?
So that is, dignity is interesting. It's a topic that belongs in a lot of conversations. For example, and sorry, this is not in the chapter, but I'm going to tell you, like, I used to work at a senior citizens, residential place when I was in high school.
Mm-hmm.
And I thought, and from that, and being with a lot of folks that were, quite in their sort of, next chapter, or, older chapters of their life,
Mm-hmm.
I would notice that people would kind of treat them like children. And I noticed how it was damaging their dignity. And I remember relating to them. I remember sitting there like, gosh, I don't, people are pitying them, looking down on them, not treating them like they would treat anybody else. And I never really realized that that's why I loved working there so much. And I related, and I had such an emotional connection to the residents. And it's because I'm like, oh, I'm not you at this point in my life, but I'm you. I feel you. And so when it came down to that, sort of the runway towards why, and helping them find their dignity. So when it comes to your child, so once you've embraced your new normal and you're ready to focus on your child, there's a lot of work to be done, because you're going to be raising them to feel secure and feel strong and feel mentally strong. They talk about, mental strength and all these things for any kid, but for a kid that's, visibly different, or appears different, or behaves in any way different, the reactions, are pretty severe. They can be very severe. And, it's hard enough for a grown-up to deal with that, but for a child, it's really strengthening that. So, I do, in the book, I have forecasting, sort of, explaining to them in advance, like, in fact, it's throughout the book, Karen, like, I have categories. I put people in categories, like, and I do that not to insult anyone, but just generally speaking, at the end of the day, the more we forecast for ourselves, even in the embracing new normal, I have categories of the way people are going to react to you and your kid. I have categories in this dignity chapter for your kid. Now you're, saying, let's anticipate what to expect. Because the more you do that with them, the more that it's sort of like a wink, wink, like, okay, I get it. This is how this person's going to be, versus feeling so blindsided. And so embracing, their dignity has a lot of important elements, and of course other parents and contributions, but it's really getting parents that appreciation and understanding, especially, I guess, look, I gave birth to my difference. And so unlike a lot of parents that are parents of children that have whatever they have, disability, difference, whatever it doesn't matter, the label doesn't matter. Because I gave birth to my difference, because I've walked the walk, I know what it feels personally like to be them. And because of that, I wanted to offer this chapter as a way of sort of like helping parents navigate through that.
I love that. I actually, one of my other guests, we actually were talking about that, about, unless you've walked the walk, whereas, I haven't walked my daughter's walk. We touched on that whole subject, and it's so true, because you truly know how it feels. Let go and let live.
So that's an expression from a dear friend of mine who passed away. But she used to use it all the time. And so it's definitely our mantra. It's essentially means that while all of us want to protect our children, as we should, when it comes to a child that is physically different or disabled, in particular, but not just physical, we have to be careful of not overprotection, and we have to figure out where that line is for our family. And by the way, that line can move day to day, depending on what we're doing and who we're dealing with. And Karen, I think this is where your contribution was. I'm pretty sure.
I think it is.
Where you said, here's where something where, I wish I would have done more. And I was like, oh my gosh, thank goodness Karen gave me that, with faith, because that was something that was necessary to include. Sometimes we do need to go overboard. And it's not saying you're overprotecting, you just need to do more.
Right.
And so we have to balance it out. And I think that, let go and let live is, finding that sweet spot where we're like, okay, if I do, let's face it, when they're really little, if we do too much, our children are going to let us do that.
Right.
And they're going to actually think that they need us to do X, Y, or Z. And so it's really kind of navigating parents through that. A lot of times, these chapters are distinctive because I really do want parents to think in this term. There's dignity is sort of on the mental part of an emotional, social, emotional, and all that. This is really in many ways sort of navigating the physical life. And again, it's not always with kids with physical disabilities and differences. Clearly it's more pronounced, but that's why we've written, I say we, it takes a village. I've written this chapter, but definitely the contributions are just so important too.
So next one, a helping hand.
Well, this is not just for people with a limb difference, even though it seems like it, but this was really, really important right after the Let Go and Let Live chapter. And the reason is, so we've spent all this time empowering our kids to be independent in the best way that works for their life and for your family's life. And yet they step outside, and and I wrote this in the book. It's like a constant version of Mighty Mouse coming to save the day, particularly when their parents are not around. And it's with the best of intentions. And so in this, I describe, I said there's a lot of forecasting in this book. Well, I forecast now, like for a parent, like here's what's going around. And I give, actually, Karen, I give like from age 3 to, I've years and years later, every year, how just examples of people like jumping in to save, and I talk about how it can feel like the best analogy is a bothersome seagull. You're just trying to eat your picnic lunch, and the seagull keeps coming in for the swoop in, and eagle means, well, they just want to eat. And similarly, so this helping hand is that, but it's also, so I give those examples, but it's also to say, here's how the different people are going to be reacting, how you're going to be reacting when people are reacting to you, or how your child's going to be reacting, and just forecasting it for you, because you're not always there to see it. And so it gives that sort of insight. And also to teach, as I wrote, the lesson that took me forever to learn, which is sometimes like you have to teach your child that they have to swallow their pride. Maybe they don't need the help. But the reason they have to swallow their pride is because maybe someone else might. And if you thwart help for, kindness for kindness sake, then the next person that they might want to focus on, they might hold back. And lo and behold, that person really could have used the help.
Yes.
And so it's really coming to that realization. And so that's what that chapter is about.
Awesome. Okay, next up, what about the families?
So this was originally called What About the Siblings, and we changed it What About the Families. Siblings I define, but it really is about whether it's a sibling, a cousin the same age. I mean, not everyone has siblings, right? So it's what about the families, but family in the context of cousin the same age, or, you could be, BFFs with your best friend who has a child, your child's age. And to me, that's like the sibling, the family. It's the same thing, right? Look, I was raised by my parents with 2 brothers. One is older, thank God. One is older, one is younger. And, the impact that they each had on me and my life, and I would tell you that there was two primary things to talk about. my younger sibling was constantly giving me the dry runs of life. Daddy, why is Maggie look like that? Why do you do that? This constant probing and speaking to me in the way my younger brother did prepared me for the same questions that I was going to get in a new class environment or wherever. My older sibling did something different. He was like, well, of course you're going to play basketball with me. Let's do it. Of course we're going to go bike riding. Let's do it. And so, while we're trying to, as parents, navigate like, okay, maybe this, maybe that, siblings are the equivalent, like I said, they're just, treating us like we want to be treated,
Yep.
which is just like a sibling or like a cousin or that's all we want to be treated. And so they give us that incredible gift. It's an incredible gift. And it goes both ways. There's such a benefit, siblings of a child that's different or disabled, of course, has, the empathy and the maturity that comes out of that is just worth its weight in gold for sure. And then finally, there's a lot of areas where it's almost like tips, like things, how siblings can empower your child with creativity in ways that, I describe in the book that my brothers did for me. So without putting in more detail right now, but that's what that is about. And I was like, oh, that's my favorite chapter. Well, that's my favorite chapter. It's my favorite chapter because I don't know what my favorite chapter is, but this one is really important and necessary because I think parents that are going through this experience feel like everything is on them to deal with it. Everything is on them. And what about the families is really all about sort of, wait a minute, there's other people that are going to be in my child's life that are going to be their support network. And it also touches upon, areas where you don't want to, well, anyway, so that was that point. Sorry. I was thinking about something else.
You are fine. Okay. So next up we have taking the bully by the horns.
Yeah, it's bull-y, bully.
Yes.
Yeah. So it's interesting. I mean, because Ethan was bullied, but it was not like a lifetime of torment, thank God. You're right. So for me, I wanted this chapter for various reasons, but one of the primary reasons that I wanted it was because most people that's my cat meowing that he's hungry. Sorry about that. Jenny. Most people that have a child who's different or disabled or becomes disabled, and so forth, we actually are not, and I know I'm speaking to generically, so I'm sure someone will be like, I disagree with you, Meg, because I was worried about this, but most of us are actually, I think, and again, based on my nonprofit and all the families that I have worked with and spoken with, we're worried about friendships. We're worried about like, okay, kindness, it's nice. It's a good goal. There's nothing wrong with kindness, but being kind to me is easier. A kid can be kind in one split second and be nice to my kid and say hi and move on because the parent said to their kid, make certain you're nice to Faith or to Ethan or to Charlie, and then they move on and they don't have to do anything else. Our kids deserve friendship. And so a lot of this chapter is talking about that and navigating through that. But I do say, however, if your child is the subject of a bully, it's really helping them through that experience, strengthening them, through role playing and other types of, recommendations that we've utilized. And also talking that's when I talk a little bit more about don't hide it, flaunt it, and the type of empathy building exercises, because, if you're experiencing it in the school, then now's the time to take action at the school in ways that are not like, putting it at least in our experience, we didn't even know who the kids were that bullied my kid. The school doesn't disclose that stuff. So you don't get that. You can't really address it in that way, at least not always. And maybe some people have access to that information. But what you can do is work with the school and think in terms of, okay, there's obviously something toxic going on. Do I need to let this happen? Do I just need to let the teachers do their thing? Or is there an opportunity here? And so a lot of the chapter sort of explores that. And again, incredible stories coming in from other people as well. I think there's one section in it that I even talk about celebrities and all, a lot of times the kid feels that is different or disabled, like I'm the only one being picked on or thought about this way. And, you learn all these different people that have just risen above everything. Yes, they're famous, but they were bullied, and they were bullied for various different things, whether it was a stutter or it was, that they had eczema, they had sometimes, and, parents can come up with their own version of what their child thinks of as a celebrity, not maybe the same that we think of, but at the end of the day, they need to know they're not alone.
Yeah.
And so that's what that chapter is about too.
Another gentleman that I had interviewed, it gutted me when, as we were talking, he had never gotten bullied, and he was actually the first one that said, but it was like kind of the opposite end. He was ignored. I'm like, I almost feel like that just rips a hole in my heart.
And that goes back to these kids need friendship.
Yeah.
I mean, that's what they need. They need friendship. Like, and that being ignored means no one was willing to do. I mean, maybe they weren't being kind, but maybe by being silent, those kids thought they were being kind to him because they didn't do anything, but they weren't, willing to have that extra step and do more. So that's really interesting. It makes me sad too. And I think that there's a lot of importance there that needs to be discussed. I think there's so many, and as you said, we in Don't Have to Flaunt It, we do a lot of programming that's ultimately anti-bullying programming. But, tell you the truth, that gets us in the door. And what we really focus on is, okay, let's get this empathy programming in place so that these kids can start to, the best way that we can get a kid to want to become a friend with another kid, not because they have the same difference or disability, but because they get them, they understand them, they feel people are friends because they have things in common. Face it. And so when we put that into play, that's when they start to realize, like, wait a minute, I feel like that too. I feel like that because, my mom's from Mexico and she has a strong accent, and people make fun of her accent or think that X, Y, or Z, and they start to talk about those things. And that's how we get to that next level.
All right.
In my opinion.
In your opinion. Well, I respect and I agree with your opinion.
Appreciate that. So glad.
Okay. So, and last but not least, additional words of wisdoms.
Yeah.
Wisdom.
So this was fun. In addition to throughout the book and the chapters, there's people like yourself that have contributed stories. What I did is, the final chapter is really this, and there's a conclusion right before this, but after the conclusion, what I do is I've asked, I think it's about 25 parents, mothers or fathers who have a child with, who are parenting their kid with, think about a multitude of visible and invisible differences, everything from epilepsy to Down syndrome to Tourette's to, it just truly autism, anxiety. I mean, you name dyslexia. I mean, there's so many limb difference, there's so many different examples, and each of those parents wrote their own story, and it's like a page each, but actually they're great for your podcast, by the way, Karen, so we should talk about Word Extraordinary continued. Let's interview all the additional words of wisdom people, because they each they each provide their own, just it's either here's what I did that was great, here's where I screwed up. I mean, I do that throughout the book, by the way. I'm not just asking them to do it. I definitely talk about where I messed up, and that's ridiculous because I have parents who did things right for me, and then I turned around and did it wrong for my boys. That's ridiculous. But, and also for our daughter too, who has ADHD, and, like she has her own version of invisible difference. And so, every parent that wrote provided those, those nuggets, like I said, either something they did that they wanted people to understand and learn from, whether it was they're proud of, they screwed up, they just want to laugh about it and think that it's fun for people to keep it real, and so forth. So I think that this is a very powerful ending, in my opinion, because I think it allows for all the people that hopefully will be buying this book to be able to say, oh, let me hook onto that person too, because I relate to that even
Right.
most directly,
Yeah.
even if I didn't with, Meg and her kids.
How many contributors would you say you had total about? Do you even know?
Maybe 40, 35 or
That's just so
40.
awesome. Like 40, so 40 different people, like the stories and the amount of and wealth of information and tips and advice and stories and that people can just pull on and learn from. I mean, that's amazing.
It's, you know why, I'll tell you, thank you for saying that and also for contributing. But one thing I learned, which was really interesting, which was when I started realizing I wanted to pull in other stories, because I learned so much from the community, Don't Have It, Flaunt It, Runway of Dream, all that kind of stuff
Mhm.
that I'm still on the advisory board. But at the end of the day, I had met so many people, but there were other people that I didn't know well that I would reach out to. And
Mhm.
I'm like, hi, I'm Meg. This is my organization. I'd love, if you'd like to just talk and Karen, one of the things I learned was most people that didn't know me, or at least have a really strong connection through someone,
Mhm.
they were not willing. So, yeah, they just didn't want to. And that's fine. Like they have,
Right.
but what it taught me was I don't take for granted the willingness of all those contributors to
Mhm.
step up. It's hard. It's
Mhm.
not something easy. And I understand that. And so I felt like, everybody that contributed had to trust me, trust that I was going to write a book that was going to, make people feel like they were a part of something important and
Yeah.
special and aligned with their priorities and what they care about. So, it's kind of no wonder, someone random's like, who's this person? I don't want to be you know what I mean? Versus all the effort
Mhm.
that I've been able to experience through Don't Have It Flaunted and meeting wonderful people like yourself.
Well, I love it. I love it all and I can't wait. Um and the other thing that the when we were talking about Alex's mother, so when she sewed his pockets up. So he is actually on the board of Camp No Limits. I hope I'm saying it's right. Have you ever heard of
Yeah,
it?
absolutely.
So
Yeah.
yeah,
Um,
he's on the board of that too.
oh my God.
And he's actually from Baltimore County, which is one county next to me. And they travel all over with it. And I absolutely loved just the meaning behind that camp too, that not only was it the kids, but it was the parents and it was the siblings. Because I always feel like the siblings are so left out. So I just thought like I was like, oh my gosh, I'm like, there needs to be a camp like that for like everybody.
Yeah, no, I agree with you. And actually, love to have the introduction because we do programming for camps.
Yeah.
So if you
Okay,
think
cool.
they might be interested, we actually have a board member who's all in on the camp stuff. So I'd love to,
Yeah, I'll definitely connect you guys. That's
yeah,
awesome.
that is great.
So before we wrap up, because I know
Yeah.
you have exciting plans, what is there anything else that you would like to share with the listeners?
Um, look, I don't take for granted that I've been able to use my life experience in a way that did a number of things. One, I thought by doing this, I'm like, oh, I just want to help others, which I do. But it is interesting every time you step outside of your box and you do something for others, you really are helping yourself,
Mhm.
and your children and so forth. And so what I would say to your listeners is, I do hope they read the book, and I do hope that it becomes a gift that keeps on giving, that their own experiences, their own ways that they've empowered their children, they get the word out, they find ways to demonstrate that, because there's going to be continued families that are going to feel just like they did.
Yep.
And I really, really, I feel so honored. Anybody that buys this book, I am absolutely honored and grateful that they, are, taking the time. And I look forward to hearing from them all, and also watching as this, sort of blossoms in the right way, in the right direction.
Perfect. Perfect. And how would one go if they wanted to book you for an event or get the book? And I'll also put all that in the show notes too.
Oh, thanks. Okay. Um, so megzucker.com is my author website. And you can buy the book, it's through and because this is published through Penguin Random House, it's like Amazon, Barnes and Noble, all the indie books and all that kind of stuff. So if you go to megzucker.com, there's about the book, and you can click on it, and then just, it'll take you to any one of those merchants that, of interest to buy the book. So I think that's pretty straightforward. And in terms of there's on that website, there's a tab that says appearances. And so someone can just click on that. And if they're interested in having me come, happy to come. We're actually I'm doing a book tour. I'm not doing a huge book tour because there's only so much time that I have in addition to my day job. But what I can do is provide to you information in terms of where I'm stopping,
Okay, good.
on that book tour, in case your listeners would like to, they're in the area. One's in DC at Politics and Prose, for example.
Okay.
So on March 16th. So we can talk about that, and happy to have you share for your listeners.
Yeah, that would be awesome. All right.
Yeah.
And then the very last thing is, as a token of appreciation, I always gift my guests with a token with a meaningful word that I hand stamp on it. Would you be willing to share what word you chose and why?
Yeah, that it's, it seems so obvious, right? But my word is flaunt. And I'm sorry, that sounds so generic. And one of the reasons it's flaunt is because in the common vernacular, flaunt could be a negative. People can think, oh, flaunting, just like, oh, excessive and all that kind of stuff. My usage for the word flaunt and how we regard it and don't know how to flaunt it is it's code for unconditional self-acceptance. That's what flaunting means. It means that you've come to this headspace where you really have kind of drowned out all the noise, and you're like, I love me for me. In the book, I talk about someone who wrote, it was actually an interview with Oprah Winfrey, but what she said is, what you have to do is let go of all the sadness you might have of what you wanted for yourself or your family or whatever, and arrive at the place that you just want to be madly in love with the life you were given. And I love that so much. And so the only way to do that for me is to become a flaunter, like just unconditional self-acceptance. And you know what's cool? Once you get to be a flaunter and you can flaunt, then you become this magnetic person. I'm not trying to say I'm so magnetic, but I think people are like, oh, please. But do you know what I mean? Like, people are like, oh, who's that? Like, and so to your point, of the kid, and I hate thinking about the kid that you mentioned, but I will say this, the kid that was ignored. I want to see, just like for my own children and anybody's children, that they're flaunters, and that those, people that are super, in that headspace, I'm telling you, no one ignores my boys or any of my kids. And I think it's because of the way they regard themselves. They know how to flaunt. And again, in the definition of the word as we describe it.
And I agree there, because at the end of his interview, he had almost died. He had kidney failure. And after all of that, that's when he came to the realization, and he said too, the acceptance of his spina bifida. Whereas before he said he really didn't accept himself that he had spina. And after that, because of everything. So yeah, I mean, you nailed it, until you have that acceptance and love yourself. And yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. I'm so glad you said that, because I'm like, oh my gosh, I don't want to sound like I'm dissing him at all.
No, but there's so much truth to it,
Yeah, totally.
So,
yeah, I'm so grateful for this conversation, Karen, and just, having the time with you. And, I admire you and everything you've done as, a person, as a parent and everything. So, we'll continue the conversation, and thank you for giving me this opportunity.
Well, thank you. And everyone, be sure to tune in, check the show notes, go buy the book, and we'll continue and just keep spreading all this awareness and love. So until next time, thanks so much. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thanks, Meg.
Thank you, Karen.
You're welcome. Thank you for joining us as we spread awareness through our personal stories and the many resources shared. You can help us by joining our village simply by sharing our show to the masses. If you would like to support the Guilbault Girls on another level, click on the link in the show notes to make a donation in any amount. Add your address and you'll receive a hand-stamped token with the word village on it in appreciation. Be sure to subscribe to our Guilbault Girls podcast and YouTube show, and don't forget to follow us on Facebook and Instagram at Guilbault Girls. Till next time.